Reporters and some lawmakers are openly talking about the president's mental stability.
President Trump's mental health?
Yes, well, I think it's another example of his being close to psychosis.
He's mentally unfit.
Increasingly delusional and paranoid behavior on the part of the president.
President Trump's fitness for office is now the top story in the country.
The leftist and mainstream media's claims that President Donald Trump is mentally unfit for office is nothing new. Ever since Trump announced his candidacy, news outlets frequently called into question his mental well-being. However, since the release of Michael Wolff's tell-all book Fire and Fury Inside the Trump White House, the media have been emphasizing this like never before. Well, for Trump at least. The American left, in fact, have a long history of attempting to paint Republican presidents and their presidential candidates as dumb or crazy, being a staple part of their political playbook for decades. One of the most prominent early examples of this is the attacks on Barry Goldwater, who ran for president as a sort of outsider Republican in 1964. While many today would disown Goldwater for his opposition to the Civil Rights Act,
I was a Goldwater girl.
Democrats didn't really attack him on this issue. Instead, they would use his shoot-from-the-hip maverick persona against him, taking out of context quotes from Goldwater's speeches to imply that he would willingly wage a nuclear war, suggesting that he had links with unsavory political figures.
So said Robert Creel of the Alabama Ku Klux Klan. He also said, I like Barry Goldwater.
And implying that Senator Goldwater was a madman who had simply taken the Republican Party hostage.
It seems to me we're up against a very different kind of a man. This man scares me. I mean, when the head of the Ku Klux Klan, when all these weird groups come out in favor of the candidate of my party.
With the help of the media, Lyndon B. Johnson, the Democrat successor to John F. Kennedy following his assassination, portrayed Goldwater as a warmonger hell-bent on bringing about a nuclear Armageddon, a claim powerfully depicted in the infamous Daisy Countdown commercial, showing a small child counting down to an atomic explosion with flower petals.
10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0.
These attacks were not limited to DNC TV commercials. They also found their way into mainstream media. Specifically, Fact Magazine decided to issue a special hit job on Goldwater, sending out over 12,000 letters to psychiatrists asking if the senator was mentally ill. And while only 2,000 responded, that was all the magazine needed to proclaim across its front page, fact. 1,189 psychiatrists say that Goldwater is psychologically unfit to be president. A manifestly unethical conclusion reached without even evaluating Goldwater personally. Goldwater was diagnosed as a megalomaniac, paranoid, and grossly psychotic. All incredible insights into a man who they had never spoke to, including one who said that he was an inwardly frightened person who sees himself as weak and threatened by strong virile power around him. The Johnson campaign began reversing Goldwater's slogan, "In your heart you know he's right," to slogans such as, "In your head you know he's wrong," and "In your guts you know he's nuts." Towards the end of the election, Johnson also ran the slogan which simply read,
"Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home."
Goldwater lost by a landslide, despite the fact that there was no evidence that he actually suffered from a mental illness. In response, the American Psychiatric Association adopted the so-called Goldwater rule to bar doctors from making such unethical diagnoses of individuals without evaluating them again. Senator Goldwater was also compensated $75,000 in a libel suit against Fact Magazine. The left and their media lackeys didn't so much paint Nixon as stupid or crazy. He rather got the evil Machiavellian treatment. However, the same could not be said for his successor, Republican President Gerald Ford, who was often depicted as clumsy because he fell over that one time, tripping down the last few steps while coming off Air Force One on a diplomatic visit to Austria. A moment that was captured by the Washington Post, who ran a picture of the incident on its front page, along with a caption, "The fall summarized the journey, stumble, fumble, tumble, and jumble." The New York Times also ran the photograph on its front page, albeit without the salacious headline. The media used this incident to construct a narrative that President Ford was a dim-witted klutz who was, you guessed it, mentally unfit for office. Echoing the words of Lyndon B. Johnson, "Jerry Ford is so dumb, he can't fart and chew gum at the same time." A pattern arose where every verbal misstep was heavily scrutinized, such as when he accidentally called the president of Egypt the president of Israel, before quickly correcting himself,
great people of the government of Egypt.
And when at the White House Christmas dinner when he wished his guests a Merry New Year.
Merry New Year! Happy New Year.
The latter comment going on to be reported by Time magazine in 1975, along with the claim that the president got his legs tangled in his dog's leads, and a picture of him falling while skiing, despite that kind of being a thing for most skiers. The Washington Post would later go on to dub Ford President Klutz, as well as calling him a hick and a national clown. Leading Time magazine in 1976 to speculate whether Ford would be the first president to be laughed out of office. However, the most damaging attacks on Jerry Ford came from late-night comedy.
Hello. Hello.
Saturday Night Live, back in a time when there was only a few channels and everyone believed what they heard on TV, lampooned Jerry Ford in a series of scathing skits featuring Chevy Chase.
Now, what's this about a press conference, Ron?
You called it, Mr. President.
Called it what?
No, you called the press conference, sir.
I see. Heel liberty.
This image was to stick with him well after his presidency.
Yes, Mr. Ford.
Well, why don't you come over and watch the game and we'll have nachos and then some beer.
Ooh. Jerry, I think you and I are gonna get along just...
It was certainly effective. By the time that the presidential debate came around between himself and Jimmy Carter, Ford found himself heavily scrutinized for the mistakes he made. Especially so for his remark that there was no Soviet domination of Eastern Europe when referring to the national spirits of places like Poland and Yugoslavia.
Could you describe what you saw on your last visit to Poland?
Well, Miss Montgomery, last year I visited the capital of Poland, and let me just say from the outset that Milwaukee is a beautiful city.
Hello. In the traditional motion picture story, the villains are usually defeated. The ending is a happy one. I can make no such promise for the picture you're about to watch.
If Barry Goldwater was dangerously insane and President Ford was a moronic klutz, then the left would depict Ronald Reagan as a simple-minded fool going senile.
The American people are not going to accept a president ain't got no brain.
What about Gerald Ford?
Reagan, an OG troll, would often see his signature sense of humor taken out of context by the media, who at times would even suggest that his jokes were putting the country in danger.
That I've signed legislation that will outlaw Russia forever. We begin bombing in 5 minutes.
By August 14th, the story became world news, a major item on Moscow television where the joke was not treated as a laughing matter.
Reagan was often subjected to mean-spirited personal attacks by media figures like former ABC anchor Sam Donaldson.
I may be the only guy in Washington who thinks that Ronald Reagan may have actually forgotten. Because I've seen him forget so often. Yeah. He introduced us to a foreign visitor in the Rose Garden. He said, here's my special guest from across the sea, Chairman Moe.
Who also on the David Letterman show in 1987 said that the biggest challenge for the president during his press conferences was to stand there and not drool. Peak media speculation about Ronald Reagan's mental fitness came after his 1984 debate with Walter Mondale. The New York Times reported that the age issue dominated the headlines in print publications and on national TV news in the aftermath. And then a Wall Street Journal headline that week went farther than most. Reading, Reagan debate performance invites open speculation on his ability to serve. And while he was initially able to bat away these charges, such as when he famously quipped in the second debate in 1984,
and I want you to know that also, I will not make age an issue of this campaign. I am not going to exploit, for political purposes, my opponent's youth and inexperience.
They cropped up again amid the Iran-Contra scandal, when Reagan claimed to have forgotten key details about his administration's selling of arms to Iran to fund rebels against the Sandinista government in Nicaragua. prompting a New Republic magazine cover in May 1987 to ask directly, "Is Reagan senile?" A Washington Post article from the same year began by noting in regards to the Iran-Contra scandal, the question was not, what did the president know and when did he know it, but what did President Reagan forget and when did he forget it? While Reagan was diagnosed with dementia 6 years after he was president in 1994,
former President Ronald Reagan has Alzheimer's disease.
White House physicians and Reagan's official biographer state that he exhibited no signs of the disease during his 2 terms. These attacks on Ronald Reagan weren't as effective as previous efforts by the left against Republicans.
Ronald Reagan knocks it right off the charts. He already is assured of at least 416 electoral votes.
The Gipper's charisma and dismissive one-liners meant that the idea that he was mentally unfit never quite gained traction in the mainstream media the same way it had done before for previous presidents.
This fellow they've nominated claims he's the new Thomas Jefferson. Well, let me tell you something. I knew Thomas Jefferson. He was a friend of mine. And Governor, you're no Thomas Jefferson.
I call upon all nations to do everything they can to stop these terrorist killers. Thank you. Now watch this drive.
Now, most people watching I'm sure to remember W. His frat boy personality and tendency to, misspeak.
Fool me once. Shame on you. If fool me, we can't get fooled again.
Yeah, George Bush says some stupid shit sometimes, but are you seriously gonna tell me that this Harvard and Yale graduate was a simpleton? And mentally unfit for office? Well, that's what the Democrats and their media bullhorns told us for pretty much the entire duration of Bush's 2 terms.
Unusually incurious, abnormally unintelligent, amazingly inarticulate, fantastically uncultured, extraordinarily uneducated.
What a relief that'll be to stop paying attention to the wars you started. Those wars, of course, are the source of some regret by our president, regret that other people made him accidentally start those wars. In other words, it's not my fault, don't blame me for that one, I just work here.
Bush was unfortunate enough to come at a time when the power of the liberal media had reached its zenith. The leftist faction in the culture war had been bubbling under the radar for quite some time now, meaning he was subjected to a relentless barrage of media criticism that found its way into everything from film to music to TV and cable news.
George, we're gonna be late for that wedding. Shit, it's training. Come on, you guys keep quiet. Follow me.
Usual suspects like the New Republic ran an article in 2003 claiming that Bush was not the brightest bulb and that it was true that Bush was just not a terribly bright man. And even in defiance of the Goldwater rule, Bush found himself too evaluated by psychiatrists who had never met him. Dr. Justin A. Frank, a psychoanalyst, released a book entitled Bush on the Couch, in which he examines Mr. Bush's early life and finds a man who consistently exhibits an array of multiple, serious, and untreated symptoms.
Joining us tonight, author and psychiatrist Dr. Justin Frank. He claims the president's obsession with Saddam and the war in Iraq are symptoms of serious, unresolved anxiety.
Concluding that our sole treatment option for his benefit and for ours is to remove President Bush from office.
What's happened is that over time, he's had to express his aggression in various displaced ways. He was, would be cruel to animals.
It was in this era of the early to mid-2000s that a series of far-left internet-based publications started cropping up. And you might think big deal now, but back then, internet media was cutting edge. People believed it, just think of all the 9/11 truthers, and the left had a complete monopoly on it. Sites like the Daily Kos declared him mentally ill, and the Huffington Post listed off more than a dozen mental health issues, citing them as the reason for the 2008 recession, claiming George Bush was mentally unsuitable for his job, and calling for presidential candidates to be screened for mental illnesses in the future. It was also in this era that we saw shows like The Daily Show and The Colbert Report become popular, meaning anti-Bush humor was not limited to NBC. But it's important to note that painting Bush as an idiot began on shows like Saturday Night Live as soon as he got into office.
What did you mean by that?
Pass.
And on one occasion, Will Ferrell, who played Bush on SNL, would reprise his role again for a political attack ad run by the Soros-funded super PAC Americans Coming Together. Other groups like MoveOn.org went as far as to even cast Bush's supporters as idiots, simply for voting for him.
No! What is it called? Halliburton? Well, Lord Almighty, do you still remember the phone number? I think I got it written down somewhere. You know? What a coincidence! That is so lucky.
And all this led the New York Times to notice that Bush jokes have started to seem like a sustained argument with the president. So it shouldn't surprise you that Democrats and their media lapdogs would use the same old dirty tricks against Donald Trump. Part of why many Republican presidents appeal to voters is their down-to-earth demeanor, their realness, which often contrasts with the general condescension of Democrats. It is part of the Democrat playbook to tarnish their opponents as mentally unfit. Goldwater, Ford, Reagan, and Bush all underwent the same treatment. Don't be fooled. Their most recent attempts to do so against Donald Trump is nothing new. Thanks for watching. Make sure to click subscribe if you're new here, and hit that like button to help a brother out. Also, if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can find me at thisinformed. Links to all social media are in the description below.